Welcome back to the Lifestyle Practice Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Derek Williams, coming at you today from near Fresno, California. I'm excited for this episode. This is one that I have thought of for quite some time, a number of years, and I think I've shared aspects of it in the past, but I want to talk a little bit more deeply about it. And it's a topic and a question that I feel like is being asked to me or around the world almost constantly. And that question has to do with, how do I deal with burnout? How do I deal with discouragement? What do I do when challenges come my way? What do I do when I just feel like I've lost hope? And it's a tough question. It's a tough position to be in, and something that can be pretty tough to think through and experience. So first off, I just want to acknowledge that, and I want to acknowledge or recognize that every single one of us that is breathing, living on this planet goes through this in some form. So to start out, when you find yourself faced with these types of experiences or questions or feelings, just know that you've got a lot of company. You're not alone. You're not the only one questioning these things and feeling this way. So sometimes for me, even just recognizing that and understanding that it's normal. There's nothing wrong with me or inherently wrong with this situation. It's what happens in life. And as much as I would love to say that over time, as I've progressed and grown in life, I still experience the ups and downs. By and large, I feel like year after year, I become a better person. I become better at leadership, better at serving and loving those around me, better at coaching, better at controlling my thoughts and, thinking and better at setting goals. But if you look at it, if I was to chart a graph of my progress during the course of my life, it would probably look a lot like the S&P 500, right? My kids invest in index funds. So I try and help them understand that when you put money in, it should be in there for the long term. You don't want to be putting in and taking out all the time. And so recently, the stock market hit an all-time high. So I was showing them and I was telling them what some of the dividends were that they had earned based on how much money they had put in. But then I tried to basically point out that, there's going to be another time period where it drops and they theoretically lose value. So I pulled up a graph of the S&P 500 and showed them, and over the course of time, how there's this general trend. But then I zoomed in and kind of showed them smaller points where it looks like a big significant drop. And if that's all you saw, you would feel very hopeless and discouraged and distraught and down. And that is very comparable to my life and probably for many other people. If we zoom in, and all too often we are too zoomed in, that's what we're going to see. We're just going to kind of see this very short period of time that either looks like it's up and we're feeling great, or it's down and we're feeling horrible about ourselves. And what we can do in those situations is to try and zoom out, to try and see the bigger picture, to understand and recognize our wins in different areas. So that's the first big point, is to recognize, first of all, it's normal. And second of all, to look at the overall trends that we're experiencing. The third point I want to make is to allow yourself to embrace things with a little bit of curiosity. Instead of feeling like you know where this is going and you know that this is bad, or whatever you want to call it, all too often we just diagnose something. We call it for how we see it, and in reality, we almost never see it how we see it in retrospect. So in my mind, that should lead us to be able to try and experience things in the moment with a little bit more curiosity, with the question, what could this lead to? What type of growth could this lead to? What kind of a person could I become after going through an experience like this? In Jay Shetty's book, Think Like a Monk, he talks about this experiment that was done. I believe it was in Arizona. And they basically tried to create these ideal, perfect conditions for these trees to grow. They had basically like this big greenhouse. I believe it was made out of glass. So they tried to create just like these perfect, as far as the gases in the air, the nutrients, the water, the sunlight, like all of these things, they tried to create this perfect condition to make like just the ideal tree, see what it would lead to. And the results of what they found was very interesting. After the trees got to a certain size, they started falling over. And it seemed like a tough question to answer. Why would they be falling over? If we've created these ideal conditions, what is it that has allowed them to somehow not be as strong as other trees? And after doing some science, some back and forth questioning and observations and data, the conclusion was that because the trees had not been exposed to wind and Mother Nature force, that they did not have to develop a strong root structure to be able to hold up against the wind. And because of that, as their mass grew, they eventually got to this point where their mass overpowered the strength of the roots and the trees simply fell. So it'd be easy to think, like for ourselves, if we can create these ideal conditions. And I think about this with my kids a lot too. I used to have this idea, what if I can just help them learn from all of my experiences? What if I can just keep teaching them these lessons so that they don't have to go through these failures and these tough experiences? Then maybe they'll have a better life than I do. Maybe they won't have to experience these downs. Now looking back, it's kind of silly, but it makes sense, right? Like I'm a good dad. I don't want my kids to experience pain and challenges. I want them to succeed and have a great life. But in a way, I'm doing the exact same thing with my kids if I approach them with that idea as the scientists were with these trees, trying to create ideal conditions so that there's no resistance that leads to any type of significant growth that's going to allow them to stand firm for years to come. I've talked about this before on the podcast, but when I read Oprah's book, The Path Made Clear, she interviewed many different people. Some were religious, some were just mentors or leaders in different capacities. And I remember I was listening to one chapter that was a priest. It might have been Catholic, but he was basically saying, if anyone looks at their life, there is no significant growth that is not accompanied by pain. And when I first heard that, I thought, nope, I don't buy that. I can grow without going through something painful. And I thought, I'm going to think of, a few examples in my life of times that I've grown significantly, and it hasn't been accompanied by pain. Well, you can probably guess I couldn't come up with anything. And it was maybe a little bit discouraging, but at the same time, it also brought a lot of peace, because once I made that recognition, then I was able to go into or be in challenging times, turbulent times, and have the thought in the middle of it, okay, if this is really hard and I allow myself to, I can learn something great from this situation. And it started getting to the point where I was like, I'd be in the middle of it, and I thought I would think, okay, what's going to come from this? I remember specifically there was a 3-week period where I felt like I was dealing with clinical challenges every single day, post-op sensitivities or extraction complications after, or just prolonged pain, or, a bridge that fractured that I did, or, something. And I remember being in the middle of that, just feeling kind of overwhelmed and stressed, and then being able to draw upon that and say, okay, I don't know what good is going to come from this, but there is going to be something good. And later, I was able to look back and recognize that there was a lot of growth during that time period, because I was able to shift my approach with patients. I got better at having conversations before treatment to let them know what was possible and what was realistic as far as expectations. I let them know as far as clinical outcomes. And I also learned certain times when it would not be wise for me to go a certain direction as far as a clinical procedure or a treatment recommendation with a patient. And ultimately, because it was in a 3-week period that was so challenging, I had to take a look. Instead of it happening, once a week or once a month, where it was just like I could kind of brush it off as kind of like a one-off scenario, it hit me so much that I had to take a step back and say, what am I going to do differently? Because with what's going on now, this is not sustainable, and I don't like these outcomes, and patients are not happy. So how am I going to shift my approach to get better outcomes? So that was a great experience for me, and changed the way that I approach things clinically and as far as communication with patients. So if you can try and be in that, think for yourself, try and go through that same exercise. Think of the greatest lessons that you've learned in your life. When has it ever been easy? Or is that true for you too? Is that true that the greatest things that you've learned have also been accompanied by challenges? And if that's true, allow yourself to sit in the challenge, in the adversity, and to decide what you're going to learn from it. Not only does it lead to great learning and great outcomes, but it makes that experience much more tolerable. And then above and beyond that, you get to the point to recognize when you're in the middle of it that not only is it tolerable, but it is the path that you want to pursue. That's what the obstacle is the way means. It doesn't mean that the obstacle can provide growth. It means that the obstacle is your path of growth. It is the way forward. By leaning in and accepting those opportunities to grow, you will grow, and you will grow in the most optimal way. And when you can approach it with that in mind, it changes the way that you experience it in that moment. Instead of it being painful and challenging, it can become a little bit more peaceful, because you can accept that it is part of your path. It is the way that things are supposed to be for you in your life at this point in time. Seneca said that we have way more fears than we do dangers. We suffer more in our imagination than we do in reality. There is a really cool episode on Netflix about mindfulness, and it's in a series called The Mind Explained. And the episode is just like between 15 and 20 minutes long. I've probably watched it 30 times, maybe not 30, maybe 20 to 30 times. And I've likely mentioned it before on the podcast, but it's packed with really good information, and it's condensed. It's very clear. And in one of the sections, they show 2 graphs. They show perceived pain in 2 different groups of people. One group that meditates and has a history of meditating, and then another group that does not have the experience of meditating. Both of them are exposed to a pain, a stimulus. I don't know if you've ever played that game where you all sit around and there's like 4 handles, and you have to, the light is like red, or maybe it's green. It's blinking though, and you have to have a very fast response to push the button. And the last person to push the button gets shocked in their hand. So it's somewhat similar to that. Someone is sitting there holding something, and they know that they're going to be shocked, but they don't know exactly when. the person that does not have a history and experience of meditating, they go through this build-up phase where there's no stimulus, there's no pain, there's no shock yet, but yet their perception of pain is steadily increasing. And then the point when the stimulus, the shock actually comes, the pain does go up a little bit, and then it takes a long time to go down. So it's almost like this big kind of mountain. There's this big buildup and then a very slow letdown. Compare that to the person that meditates and how they experience pain. There's essentially no buildup. When the stimulus comes, when there's the shock, that shock is stronger. There is a higher peak in that person as far as their perceived pain, higher than the person that didn't meditate, but then it very quickly goes away after the stimulus. So again, now that I've shared that, let me repeat that quote from Seneca. He said, "We have way more fears than dangers. We suffer more in our imagination than we do in reality." I think this is true. It's true for me when I think of the challenging times or the challenging thoughts that I go through. So much of what plays into that is things that have not actually occurred. One thing that I work through a lot with clients is, this idea. This has a lot to do with abundance mindset and scarcity mindset. But there's for most of us in our careers in practice ownership, there's kind of this thought looming in the back of our head of when is this all going to fall apart? Or, okay, I just had the best month ever. What's next month going to be like? If this month was really good, maybe next month's going to be really bad. And it can be challenging to deal with those kinds of thoughts and experience those kinds of things. But guess what? We have way more fears than we do dangers. We suffer more in our imagination than we do in reality. So keep that in mind. When you find yourself experiencing burnout or anxiety or discouragement, think to yourself, what is the worst case scenario? What is that thought that you're embracing or that you're thinking about? Take a step back and think, is this true? Is this going to happen? Has this happened? And take some time to evaluate it. Evaluate that thought and just recognize, is this helpful? Is this a useful thought? Is this a good use of my time? Is this a good ROI on where I can be spending my thoughts right now? And my experience is that as you start to evaluate and look at that, you can start to replace thoughts or abandon certain thoughts that you realize are not being helpful and start focusing on other things that are. And as you do that, it starts to become muscle memory. Something that was initially very challenging to think through and recognize becomes a little bit easier and eventually becomes muscle memory, where it starts to become a little bit more automatic. And that's when it gets really fun, because then you can start dealing with some adversity and that autopilot brain, that muscle memory kicks in and you start to experience things in a fun way, where your brain is just evaluating the thoughts and going through, or, you've thrown up that thought so many times that you just don't even face it. The last thing that I want to share is to be willing to look to others. In reality, there's no one that can help you but yourself. But sometimes when you look at others, it allows you to help yourself in a way that you may not have been able to previously. We hear stories all the time of there's some barrier, the mile being run. Everybody thought it couldn't be ran in under 4 minutes, and then somebody does it, and then within the next year, 4 other people do it. It's a mental thing. So sometimes looking at other people and what they've gone through can provide a path forward, or they can provide an ability for us to believe something when we may not have believed it initially on our own. Today, I was on a flight from Phoenix to Fresno, and the guy that I sat next to on the plane, I noticed he had a walking stick. He was, I found out later, he was 64 years old. we started talking, and I started asking him questions about his blindness. He told me that he could see about 25% of what most people could see. So he can't read. Um, he can he can't like see faces clearly. He can tell that there's someone there, but he can't tell what their face looks like. It was a 2-hour flight, but man, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I was able to ask him a lot of questions. This was only 3 years ago, so he was 61 when he was diagnosed with an aggressive age-related macular degeneration, and for a year he went through very rapid digression of his eyesight. And he told me that for about a year and a half, it was, he actually said this, he said, no pun intended, it was a very dark time. I appreciated his ability to have humor in talking through the experience. But he talked about how challenging it was. He had been a UPS truck driver for several years and trained other truck drivers. He was an electrician and a plumber and helped with building houses. So a very hardworking guy, very skilled as far as what he could accomplish with his hands, what he could create and achieve. And he said that it was a very challenging time for him. And when I asked him, I said, "What helped you come out of that?" Because he seemed like such a positive person. And then realizing that it's only been 3 years ago, he could see like perfectly, just about. And it was a very dark time, but yet now he seems very positive, very just in general motivated. And so I asked him about that, and he said, what's interesting? He said, I was pretty down in the dumps for a long time, and I watched a video. It was from the Make-A-Wish Foundation. I watched a video of a young girl that was going through this same sort of process, losing her vision. She knew that she was only going to have her vision for so long, and she decided that one thing that she wanted to see before she lost her eyesight was the sunset on the Golden Gate Bridge. And he said that when he learned about her and what she had done and how she had approached things and looked at things, he thought, if she can do it, I can totally do this. I've had a long life. I've had so many years to see things and do things. I can do this. And that was a huge turning point for him. He was then motivated at that point to become independent again. So he started learning how to use public transportation. He went back to work and started doing electrical work again, which he said he doesn't really do that too much more now, but he learned certain things about how to do wiring. He said that it took him, in the beginning, 3 or 4 times longer than normal, but he picked up on things and learned how to be able to still do some of that work. It was really a lot of fun to ask him questions and to see, and there really wasn't a whole lot of bitterness in his voice. I was impressed by that. I even asked him at one point, I said, do you find yourself facing the thought, oh, I just wish I could see that. I wish I could see this. And he told me, he said, do you know what? He said, no, not really. He said, mostly I just think of all the things I was able to see. I was able to see so much. And I thought that was beautiful. But he did share, he did say, my youngest granddaughter, I've never seen her face. And that was humbling to hear that. But again, the point here that I'm making with this man, his name was Steve. I actually offered him a ride home. He was going to get a ride home on a bus, figure out something, and I said, "Let me give you a ride home." And so I was able to do that. I got a picture with him, so I'll have to share that on the TLP Facebook page. But I really enjoyed And again, the lesson that I want to point out is he wasn't able to get out of his funk. He wasn't able to get out of his own way until he saw someone else, until he saw the progress of what someone else was making, what they were doing with their life, instead of choosing to sulk. And we can do the same thing. You can listen to me and hear how I've been miserable at times. You can share your experiences with others. You can read. As I've shared, we're so fortunate to live in a day and age where there's so many people that can connect with each other. 20, 30 years ago, this blind guy never would have seen anything like this girl, the video that he saw. He wouldn't have been exposed to it. So we're so fortunate that we can be listening to podcasts and books. We can be aware of people on the other side of the planet and what they're saying and what they're teaching, what they're pushing for. So it's a great time to be alive, where we can choose who to put in our corner, who we can look at for examples in doing things and pushing ourselves. The last point that I want to share is that a lot of times it can be very tempting when we're in some sort of obstacle or adversity. It can be very tempting to look at something and say, to look at it in a way where we think the way that I'm going to get through this is by getting rid of this, right? If it's a tough case, we think, oh, the way I'm going to get rid of it is by, quitting it, or the job. Maybe the way that I get past this horrible job is just by quitting. The way that I, get away from the stress of dentistry is to figure out some side gig and get somewhere else. All of those things may be true to an extent. You may be able to find a path that works better and you enjoy more by learning from those experiences. But don't allow that opportunity to grow to pass you by. Don't step over it so quickly. Think about the situation and think, what can you be learning from it? Even if it's a very challenging situation where you think maybe there's nothing you can learn from it, even you can think of how going through a difficult experience can benefit you in future difficult experiences. There's always something that we can learn from every situation. So thank you for listening today. I'd love to hear any of your guys' thoughts out there as far as how you deal with adversity, how you are able to move forward in your life. But I hope you were able to take away some of these things and try and apply them. So take care. Everyone, keep pushing it in your lives. I think that's one of the funnest things about our life, is that we're in much more control than we think that we are. So keep pushing. Take nothing off the table. Keep looking at your goals, where you want to get to. See how you can learn from what's in front of you today in this moment, because there is nothing more than this moment, and that's all there ever will be. Take care. We will talk to you guys next time.